Good evening, esteemed generals, and welcome to a new episode of Men Around the Führer. Our tale starts in April 7th, 1945. A small, white-haired man sits in a concrete cell in Flossenbürg concentration camp. His name is Wilhelm Canaris. For nearly a decade, he ran Germany's military intelligence service. He knew every secret, every agent, every operation, and now he knows he has less than 24 hours to live. But here's the twist that makes his story so disturbing. He didn't just fail at his job, he actively sabotaged it. The man who was supposed to protect the regime spent years trying to destroy it from the inside. He played both sides. He fed intelligence to the enemy. He warned targets about assassination attempts. He was a double agent running the very organization meant to catch double agents. And yet, when you look at his track record, one question haunts everything. Was Wilhelm Canaris a brilliant resistance hero? Or was he simply the most incompetent intelligence chief in modern history who convinced himself his failures were sabotage? Because by the time Berlin discovered what he'd been doing, the damage was catastrophic. Operations blown, agents captured, military secrets leaked. The intelligence service he ran had become a joke among the Allies. Tonight, we're examining the case of the admiral who tried to play God and ended up playing the fool. This is the story of Wilhelm Canaris, the spy who couldn't decide which side he was on. To understand Canaris, you need to understand something about spies. The best ones are never the loudest people in the room. Wilhelm Franz Canaris was born in 1887 in the Ruhr Valley, not to aristocracy, not to military greatness. His father was a mining engineer, comfortable but not elite. And this matters because Canaris spent his entire life trying to compensate for not being born into the officer class he so desperately wanted to join. He was short, 5'4", quiet, unassuming, the kind of person who could disappear in a crowd, which is exactly what made him dangerous. He joined the Imperial Navy in 1905, served on a cruiser in World War I, got shipwrecked off the coast of Chile, escaped, made his way through South America using forged papers and fake identities. This wasn't a combat hero's journey. This was a con man's origin story. By the time he returned to Germany, he'd discovered his true talent: deception. In the chaos of the Weimar Republic, Canaris joined the Reichsmarine. He was assigned to intelligence work. And here's where his psychological profile gets interesting. He wasn't ideological. He wasn't a true believer in anything. He was a pragmatist who believed in one thing above all else: survival. When the regime took power in 1933, Canaris saw which way the wind was blowing. He kissed the ring, he played the game, and in January of 1935, he was appointed head of the Abwehr, the military intelligence service. He was 47 years old, and he'd just been handed the keys to the most dangerous job in Germany. Now here's what you need to understand about the Abwehr under Canaris. It was never meant to be powerful. It was a military intelligence service in a regime that didn't trust the military. The real intelligence power belonged to the SS, specifically to Reinhard Heydrich's Sicherheitsdienst, the SD. This created a bureaucratic nightmare. Two intelligence services, both competing for resources, both spying on each other, both trying to undermine the other's operations. And caught in the middle was Wilhelm Canaris, a man who specialized in playing both sides. But there's a problem with playing both sides. Eventually, you forget which side you're actually on. Let's talk about Reinhard Heydrich. Tall, blonde, ruthless. Everything Canaris wasn't. Heydrich ran the SD with brutal efficiency. He was a true believer, a fanatic, the kind of person who sent people to concentration camps before breakfast and slept soundly at night. And he hated Canaris, not because of ideology, but because Canaris had something Heydrich wanted: legitimacy. Canaris was a Navy man, an officer, old school. He had connections to the traditional military establishment. Heydrich, on the other hand, had been kicked out of the Navy for a sex scandal. He was an outsider, and that ate at him. The two men had a strange relationship. On the surface, they were cordial. They even lived on the same street in Berlin. Their wives were friends. They had dinner together, played chess, exchanged pleasantries, but underneath, They were engaged in a cold war for intelligence supremacy. Here's how the rivalry played out. Heydrich would feed Canaris false intelligence to make him look incompetent. Canaris would withhold critical information from Heydrich, claiming the Abwehr needed to verify sources. Heydrich would plant spies inside the Abwehr. Canaris would recruit SD officers to feed him information about what Heydrich was planning. It was a paranoid spiral. And the irony is that while these two were playing spy games against each other, actual enemy intelligence services were running circles around both of them. The British had broken German codes. The Soviets had infiltrated both organizations. The Americans were building an intelligence apparatus that would eventually dwarf anything Germany had. But Canaris and Heydrich were too busy sabotaging each other to notice. Let me give you a specific example of how dysfunctional this became. Operation Bernhard, the plan to counterfeit British currency and flood England with fake pounds to destroy their economy. This was an SD operation, but the Abwehr had the technical expertise to make it work. Heydrich asked Canaris for help. Canaris said yes. Then he proceeded to slow-walk every aspect of the operation. He assigned incompetent people. He lost paperwork. He claimed the printing presses weren't ready. Why? Not because he cared about Britain's economy, but because he couldn't stand the idea of Heydrich getting credit for a successful operation. This is the banality of bureaucratic evil. Two intelligence chiefs so obsessed with their rivalry that they forgot they were supposed to be fighting a war. But then, in 1942, something changed. Heydrich was assassinated in Prague. Czech resistance fighters, trained by British intelligence, ambushed his car. He died of his wounds a week later. Canaris attended the funeral. By all accounts, he seemed genuinely shaken. Some historians think he mourned his rival. Others think he mourned the loss of the one person who truly understood the game they were playing. With Heydrich gone, Canaris should have been free. The SD was in chaos. The path to intelligence supremacy was clear. But here's the twist. Canaris didn't consolidate power. He didn't expand the Abwehr's reach. Instead, he seemed to lose interest in the game entirely. Because by 1942, Wilhelm Canaris had made a decision that would doom him. He'd decided to switch sides. Let's be clear about something. Wilhelm Canaris was not a hero. He didn't wake up one morning and decide to fight tyranny because of moral conviction. He wasn't motivated by justice or ethics or a burning desire to save humanity. He switched sides because he'd done the math, and he'd concluded Germany was going to lose. This is important, because the mythology around Canaris often portrays him as a noble resistance figure, a spy who risked everything to stop the regime from within. But the reality is more complicated and much darker. Canaris didn't resist. He hedged his bets. Here's how it worked. Starting around 1940, Canaris began making contact with Allied intelligence through neutral countries: Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, Turkey. He used Abwehr agents as go-betweens. He passed information, not everything, not enough to completely compromise German military operations, but enough to prove he was helpful. He warned the Allies about planned operations. He provided information about troop movements. He even tipped off targets of assassination attempts. But here's the catch. He kept running the Abwehr as if nothing had changed. He still sent agents into enemy territory. He still gathered intelligence for German military operations. He still attended meetings where invasion plans were discussed. He was trying to stay valuable to both sides. A double agent's ultimate fantasy, being indispensable to everyone. The problem with this strategy is that it requires perfect execution, and Canaris was not a perfect executor. Let me give you examples of his incompetence. Operation Pastorius, 1942. The plan to land German saboteurs on American soil to blow up factories and infrastructure. Canaris personally selected the team. 8 men, trained them himself, gave them explosives and American currency. They landed in New York and Florida. Within 2 weeks, 2 of them had turned themselves in to the FBI. The entire operation was rolled up. 6 were executed. The other 2 became double agents. Total cost: 8 trained agents, thousands of Reichsmarks, and complete humiliation. The Cicero Affair, 1943. An Albanian working as a valet for the British ambassador in Turkey offered to sell secrets to German intelligence. Codename Cicero. He photographed top-secret documents, invasion plans, conference notes, priceless intelligence. The Abwehr paid him in counterfeit British pounds from Operation Bernhard. The Operation Canaris had sabotaged. But here's the real failure. Canaris didn't believe the intelligence was genuine. He thought it was too good to be true, so he filed it away and never acted on it. Meanwhile, Cicero was giving Germany actual, legitimate intelligence about Allied invasion plans, and Canaris dismissed it as disinformation. This is the paradox of Canaris. Was he incompetent, or was he sabotaging his own organization? And does it even matter if the result is the same? The Valkyrie Connection. By 1944, Canaris was connected to virtually every resistance cell in Germany. He knew about plots. He knew about conspiracies. He knew that senior military officers were planning to assassinate the leader. And he did nothing. He didn't report them. But he didn't actively help them either. He stayed informed. He positioned himself to be on the winning side. Whichever side won. This is the most damning indictment of Wilhelm Canaris. When it actually mattered, when there was a real chance to change the course of history, he hedged. The July 20th plot failed. The leader survived, and the SS began investigating everyone who'd been even tangentially connected to the conspiracy. Wilhelm Canaris's name was on that list. February 1944. The Abwehr is dissolved. Canaris is fired, not arrested, not executed, just relieved of duty. Why? Because by 1944, the intelligence failures had become impossible to ignore. Operations blown, agents captured, entire networks rolled up by enemy counterintelligence. The Abwehr had become a liability. The SD absorbed what was left. The Abwehr ceased to exist, and Wilhelm Canaris, the ghost who'd played both sides for nearly a decade, found himself without a job. He was assigned to the Office of Commercial and Economic Warfare, a nothing position, a desk job. They gave him an office and told him to write reports nobody would read. For a man who'd spent his entire career manipulating people and information, this was torture. He was irrelevant, powerless, and he knew what was coming. The Gestapo was investigating the resistance networks. They were finding documents, interrogating suspects, following trails, and all of those trails led back to the Abwehr, back to officers Canaris had protected, back to operations he'd sabotaged, back to him. July 20th, 1944. The assassination attempt failed, the leader survived, and the purge began. They arrested everyone, military officers, diplomats, bureaucrats, anyone who'd ever expressed doubt or criticism. The Gestapo cast a wide net, and Wilhelm Canaris was caught in it. They arrested him on July 23rd, 3 days after the assassination attempt. At first, they didn't have concrete evidence, just suspicions, connections, the testimony of tortured conspirators who'd mentioned his name. But Canaris was a skilled interrogator himself. He knew how to deflect, how to misdirect, how to play for time. He denied everything. He claimed ignorance. He said he'd been retired, out of the loop, uninvolved, and for months it worked. They kept him in custody, but they didn't execute him. They moved him from prison to prison. They interrogated him repeatedly, but they couldn't break him until they found the diaries. In a safe in a military installation, investigators found diaries kept by Canaris's deputy, Hans Oster, detailed records of meetings, conversations, operations, proof of sabotage, proof of contact with the resistance, proof of everything. Wilhelm Canaris had spent his career in the shadows. He'd been careful. He'd covered his tracks, but his deputy had kept receipts. The evidence was undeniable. Canaris had been working against the regime. He'd protected conspirators. He'd sabotaged operations. He'd passed intelligence to the enemy. But here's the fascinating part. Even when confronted with the evidence, Canaris never admitted to moral motivation. He never claimed he was fighting for justice or freedom or humanity. His defense was simple. He was a professional. He served Germany, not the regime. And when it became clear the regime would destroy Germany, He did what he thought was necessary to preserve something for the future. It was the defense of a bureaucrat, a technocrat, a man who genuinely believed he'd been playing a rational game all along. The SS didn't care about his rationalizations. On April 5, 1945, they held a summary court-martial. No defense attorney, no witnesses, just a formality, guilty, death sentence, to be carried out immediately. April 9, 1945. 5 a.m., Flossenbürg concentration camp. They stripped him naked, led him to the gallows. A slow strangulation hanging, the cruelest execution method they had. Wilhelm Canaris, the spymaster who'd tried to play both sides, died knowing he'd failed at everything. He hadn't saved Germany. He hadn't stopped the regime. He hadn't even saved himself. 3 weeks later, the war in Europe was over. The regime collapsed. Germany surrendered. If Canaris had held out for 21 more days, he would have survived. But that's not how intelligence work operates. There are no medals for almost winning, no redemption for hedging your bets, no credit for playing both sides when both sides lose. So what do we make of Wilhelm Canaris? After the war, the Allies found his files, boxes of intelligence reports, documentation of contacts, evidence of his attempts to help them. And for a while there was a narrative that emerged. Canaris was a hero, a resistance fighter, a good German who'd tried to stop the madness from within. But that narrative doesn't hold up under scrutiny, because if you actually look at what Canaris did, the pattern isn't heroism. It's cowardice dressed up as pragmatism. He didn't risk everything to fight evil. He positioned himself to survive regardless of who won. He passed just enough intelligence to the Allies to prove he was helpful, but not enough to actually change the course of the war. He protected some resistors, but not all of them. He sabotaged some operations, but ran others successfully. He was a man playing a game of personal survival while the world burned around him. Compare him to someone like Klaus von Stauffenberg, who planted the bomb on July 20th. Stauffenberg knew it was a suicide mission. He knew he'd probably die. He did it anyway because he believed it was right. Canaris never took that kind of risk. He never committed. He never chose a side decisively. And in the end, that's what killed him. Not his actions against the regime, but his inability to commit to anything fully. He tried to be everyone's asset and became no one's ally. The Abwehr under his leadership was catastrophically ineffective. Whether that was intentional sabotage or genuine incompetence is almost irrelevant. The result was the same. One of the most important intelligence services in the world, run into the ground by a man who couldn't decide what he believed in. There's a broader lesson here about moral courage, about the difference between resistance and hedging your bets, about what happens when you try to play both sides of a moral abyss. Wilhelm Canaris spent 9 years trying to be the smartest person in the room, the one person who could see all the angles, play all the players, survive any outcome. But intelligence isn't about being clever, it's about commitment, about believing in something enough to risk everything for it. And that's the one thing Canaris could never do. He was a spy who couldn't trust anyone, including himself, an intelligence chief who didn't believe his own intelligence, a double agent who betrayed everyone, including the people he claimed to be helping. In the end, Wilhelm Canaris wasn't a hero or a villain. He was something more pathetic, a bureaucrat who convinced himself that survival was the same as morality, that hedging was the same as resistance, that being clever was the same as being brave. He died alone in a concentration camp, naked and strangled, having failed at everything he'd attempted. 3 weeks before his side would have won. That's not tragedy. That's just waste. The man who stands in the middle of the road gets hit from both directions. Wilhelm Canaris never learned that lesson. Or maybe he did, and just couldn't accept it. Either way, the result was the same. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.